I'm going to be detailing the process that I use to convert some fairly cheap birdshot rounds into some usable slug loads. I started off by creating a hole trimming template out of a small piece of 3/4 inch EMT pipe. Then I used that template to open the hull and harvest the birdshot. The length of this template was chosen for two reasons. One, it kept the cut above the wad, and two, after applying the 1/4 inch roll crimp at the end of this process, it keeps the finished product at 2 inches long, which eliminates the tumbling problem that occurs with shorter rounds during feeding, which in turn eliminates the need for an OPSAW adapter. It also creates a clean, straight, repeatable cut. Next, I remove the wad from the hole with a pair of tweezers, trying not to lose any of the powder. You'll notice that I use pieces of 5/8 inch dowel for a few different steps in this process. Here I'm using a piece of it to get the powder to release from the wad. This is one of the areas where the Winchester rounds and the Federal rounds are slightly different. The Federals have a 2-piece wad, which means you never have to see or deal with the powder whatsoever. Here I'm going to use a piece of the dowel to push the powder back into place, trying not to compact the powder into the base. I have had a few instances where a static on my fingers would move the powder while I was handling the hull. I found that utilizing a little bit of hand cream will totally eliminate that issue. After that, I created a 2-part jig to trim roughly a 1/4 inch off the top of the wads. For the first part of the jig, I used a cut down, once shot hull, a Lee 7/8 ounce slug for a spacer, and a small piece of dowel to help me seat the wad into the jig. Using the dowel to seat the wad into the jig is more relevant during the Federal reconstruction than the Winchester, due to the fact that the wads are more tightly fitting in the Federals than they are the Winchesters. The second part of my wad trimming jig consists of a piece of dowel mounted in my vise with a small amount of electrical tape wrapped around the end. What this setup does is keeps the petals from moving while being cut and gives you a straight, repeatable result. The electrical tape just keeps the wood from splintering during the process, and then the missing primer in the one-shot hole creates a nice spot to push out the cut wad. Reconstructing the round is fairly simple. I do use a 20 gauge overshot card under the slug to take up excess space, which will reduce powder migration and also help the slug release from the wad in flight. While reinserting the slug and the wad back into the hole, just be sure not to crush the compression zone of the wad with too much pressure. The final step of this process is the roll crimp. Published data indicates that a roll crimp takes less pressure to open than a fold crimp. There's also published data indicating that a 1/4 inch of hole is required for a proper roll crimp. I used a cheap Harbor Freight drill press for this step, just for consistency. The press is set on its lowest RPM setting, and my stop is set so that my rounds are roughly 2 inches long. I have seen research indicating that lubricating the rim of the hole or the crimp tool itself helps with this step, but I've found that building up heat in the crimp tool by doing the first few rounds slowly works just as well. Basically what happens here is that by the time the crimp tool bottoms out on top of the slug, the rolled hole plastic is making contact with the slug, which keeps everything snug. Typically I'll wear gloves while handling ammo so that the oils in my skin don't affect the round in any way, but this is one of those instances where I'd suggest not wearing any gloves. Loose fitting clothing and spinning machinery don't mix. I just try to keep my fingers on the plastic of the hull. Next I'm going to show the Federal reconstruction process. It's basically the same with a few exceptions. Cutting the round open and harvesting the birdshot is exactly the same. Using the 3/4 inch EMT pipe template will give you a clean, straight, repeatable cut every time. One thing to note here is that the whole plastic is thicker in the Federals, and the top of the wad sits slightly lower than the Winchesters. This will be relevant when it's time to add the filler under the slug. Next, reworking the wad is different due to the fact that the Federals have a two-piece wad. The good thing is that you don't have to deal with the powder at all, but you will have to cut the pedal slits down to the base of the wad. This will help the slug release from the wad in flight. I would like to note that on basically all of the Federal rounds, the bottom piece of the wad seemed to be cracked on the top of the compression column. I have no idea if this is relevant in any way. I'll be discussing the test results a little later on. With the Federals, the spacer in the wad cutting jig has to be a little longer. Here I'm using a small piece of dowel. Using another piece of dowel to insert the wad into the jig here will be much more relevant than the Winchesters due to the fact that the wads are much tighter in the Federals. Trimming of the pedals are exactly the same as the Winchesters. You might want to replace the tape on the inner piece of dowel every so often. You can see how this jig gives you a nice straight repeatable cut. Reconstruction of the hull is basically the same as the Winchesters with the exception of the filler. With the thicker hull plastic and the top of the wad being a little lower, the filler had to be thicker to maintain the 2-inch shell length. I found that a .70 nitro card was perfect for this. And again, just try not to damage the compression zone of the wad while you're reinserting everything. Roll crimping the Federals are the same as the Winchesters with one small exception. The thicker hull creates a situation where the whole plastic comes into contact with the slug before the slug bottoms out in the crimping tool. So the slug ends up being slightly lower than the top of the roll crimp, where the Winchesters tend to be basically even with the top of the roll crimp. So basically the slug sits slightly deeper in the hull. This would be relevant for anybody that's concerned with premature detonation of a round that's inside of a tubular magazine, where your slug is sitting against the primer of the round in front of it during recoil. There is some good data and a few good videos on that subject. I'd suggest that you do your own research and draw your own conclusions. This is the firearm that I used for all my testing on these rounds. If you're interested and want to know more about this shotgun, I've published a video of it on my channel, minus the red dot. You're more than welcome to go over there and check it out. It's a Mossberg 500, and the red dot is a Sightmark Wolverine FSR with a 2 MOA dot. Alright, so now for the results of my testing. The Winchesters, though harder to work with, held their velocities with way more consistency. They averaged 60 foot per second above the advertised foot per second on the box. The Federals created a better looking result with the thicker hull and the more inset slug, but the velocities jumped all over the place. They ranged from 480 to 1300 foot per second. I don't know if it was the cracked compression columns, the type or amount of powder, the wads fitting tighter in the holes, or just the thicker hull plastic. They just weren't as consistent as the Winchesters. But both rounds were equally accurate. Over the 300 rounds or so that I tested, this seemed to be a typical grouping. Notice the circular shape of the holes, indicating that there was no tumbling of the slugs. Here are some pictures of the recovered wads, slugs, and overshot cards from the Winchesters, and also some pics from the slugs, nitro cards, and wads from the Federals. The Winchesters seem to be releasing about 20 yards, and the Federals seem to be releasing at roughly 15 yards, as you can see from this next little video clip coming up. Shot 22, 1274. Now I'm going to take a few minutes to discuss overpressure. This was my biggest concern when I started this project, since there's really no reputable published data for converting birdshot rounds into slug loads. So what I did, besides consuming as much information on the subject that was available online in the manuals, was to take what I considered to be some common sense steps to try to avoid overpressure. First, I lightened the load of the round. Then, when I was casting my slugs, I added some purchased pure lead to try and keep my lead as soft as possible. Then I used a shotgun with an open bore. And then finally I used a roll crimp, knowing that a roll crimp takes less pressure to open than a fold crimp. I do not, repeat, do not advocate anyone altering factory ammunition. For me, in this case, I felt like the risk was worth the reward. Everything I've done to these rounds should reduce the resistance of the projectile while it's exiting the hull and the barrel. If you choose to alter factory loaded ammunition, it will be at your own risk. As far as overpressure signs on the shells themselves, there's basically two trains of thought. One being that there are no signs. Catastrophic damage to the shotgun and possibly yourself will be the one and only sign. The second train of thought is that there are 4 indicators to look for. One being the functionality of the shotgun, which means that the felt recoil and the report of the firearm is normal during operation. 2, the shells extract with relative ease. 3, the primers are not completely flattened. And finally 4, the firing pin strike marks on the primers aren't too shallow. Out of everything on this list, I personally think that having extraction problems is the best indicator of overpressure. Too much pressure and the brass will bulge and get stuck in your chamber. If you have extraction issues, stop immediately and figure out what's going on. Everything else on this list can be interpreted differently by different people. For example, here are 6 fired holes that I had on hand. 2 are my reconstructed rounds, and the other 4 are factory loads. The reconstructed loads seem to fall right in the middle. There are factory loads that have more flattened primers with shallower strikes, and factory loads with more rounded primers with deeper strikes. So this doesn't seem to be a good indicator to me. There is one last thing I'd like to share. It's what most people call the push test. While the slug sits in the wad, you should be able to push them through an open bore with relative ease. If you can't, this could indicate a problem with the diameter of your slug. You might have an issue with your casting process. My final thoughts on the birdshot to slug conversion project are that I personally find these rounds to be totally acceptable, at least out to 50 yards. If I have a choice, I'll be seeking out the Winchesters rather than the Federals. The Winchesters hold their velocity with more consistency, and since the wads are a bit looser, the wad pedals tend to stay intact. In any real situation, nothing can replace factory loaded ammo, but these could do in a pinch, or if birdshot was the only thing available. I know that I wouldn't hesitate to utilize them. That's going to conclude my birdshot to slug conversion project. If anyone out there has any questions, useful information, or data, please feel free to post it in the comments. Stay safe and God bless.